Good afternoon, good morning, or evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. Welcome to the webinar Advocating for Peace, an Advent Call for Ceasefire in Palestine and Israel. My name is Aimee Hong, and I serve as a Senior Executive Director of Education and Engagement at the General Board of Church and Society, and I will be moderating this webinar today. Church and Society is located in Washington, D.C., the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Anacostan peoples who lived for generations neighboring the Piscataway and the Pamunkey peoples. We gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather and the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. For participants who are blind or low vision, or perhaps only listening, I am a Korean American woman with black hair tied back, wearing a yellow shirt and a green cardigan. A special thanks to James Kang, our Senior Specialist of Communications, for providing technical support for this webinar. Another thank you to General Board of Global Ministries and United Methodist Kairos Response for sponsoring this webinar. A short overview of our time together. After the panel discussion, there will be a Q&A, and please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and they will be answered during the Q&A time. We anticipate that this webinar will have many resources and action items mentioned. So an email will be sent out to participants with a link to this recorded webinar, along with other resources mentioned, including ways to take action. And you should be receiving that by the end of today to be a continued resource to you and to your community. This Sunday was the second Sunday of Advent, a time for Christians to focus on peace as we wait for the birth of Christ. Many congregations chose not to light the second Advent candle, representing peace and solidarity with those who are suffering in the Holy Land, and in memory of the 1,147 Israelis and over 18,400 Palestinian lives killed on October 7th and since. Others lit the peace candles in hope that the light would pierce the darkness that we feel these days. I'm sure that many of us, including myself, prayed for guidance. How can we be advocates for peace in such a time as now? How can we be peacemakers? So today I'm really excited and honored to have Palestinian Christian leaders and Christian advocates for peace to help us better understand the context of October 7th and how we can be peacemakers. I am honored to introduce you to our panelists for today. Reverend Dr. Alex Awad was born and raised in Jerusalem. For 26 years, he and his wife Brenda served as missionaries with the General Board of Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church in Israel and Palestine. He was also the pastor of an international church in East Jerusalem and taught courses at Bethlehem Bible College, where he served as faculty, dean of students, and also as a board member. Until his retirement in 2015, Reverend Awad directed the Shepherd Society, which is a humanitarian arm of Bethlehem Bible College. Reverend Awad has also written books, Through the Eyes of the Victims and Palestinian Memories, books that reveal the realities of life under Israeli military occupation. Jonathan Kuttab is a Palestinian international human rights attorney practicing in the U.S., Palestine, and Israel. He is executive director of Friends of Sabeel North America and also a co-founder of Palestinian human rights group Al-Haq and the co-founder of Nonviolence International. He also serves on the board of Bethlehem Bible College and is the president of the board of Holy Land Trust. He was also the head of the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement of 1994 between Israel and the PLO. He has written 2 books, Beyond the Two-State Solution, and most recently, The Truth Shall Set You Free. On behalf of Reverend Dr. May Cannon, the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace, who is quite sick today, we have Kyle Cristofalo, the Senior Director of Advocacy and Government Relations, and the Special Advisor to the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. Thank you so much for being with us, Kyle, on such short notice. In his role as CMEP, he is responsible for leading CMEP's engagement with Congress and the administration and advocacy priorities. He also helps equip CMEP's grassroots supporters to engage directly with their congressional offices. David Wildman is the Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with the United Methodist Church's General Board of Global Ministries. He also works on behalf of GBGM, with grassroots partners in the Middle East and Afghanistan. David helped found United for Peace and Justice in October 2002, and the U.S. campaign to end Israeli occupation in 2001, and serves on its steering committee. He also serves on the World Council of Churches Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum Core Group. Colleen Moore is the Director of Peace with Justice at the General Board of Church and Society, and in her position, she is responsible for developing and managing the agency's legislative and policy advocacy in support of peace and justice. She works in coalition with United Methodist Faith and Secular Coalitions to advance church and society's strategic priorities on peace building, conflict resolution, non-proliferation, disarmament, and multilateralism. Prior to GBCS, Colleen served as Advocacy Director at Women Cross DMZ, and she recently consulted with several organizations on policy and advocacy, including the American Friends Service Committee and Quincy Institute. She previously held roles at Global Zero, Beyond the Bomb, Win Without War, and Seeds of Peace. You all have such long accomplishments. Thank you all for being with us today. As we're going to jump right into the panel discussion part of our webinar today. And the first question goes to Reverend Dr. Alex Awad. Reverend Alex, can you help our participants who might not be aware of the larger history of Israel and Palestine, and to help put October 7th into context, meaning that history didn't start on October 7th? Can you provide the history behind the ongoing violence that we see today and how it has impacted your life? I believe you are muted right now.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right, thank you, Aimee, and thank you, General Board of Church and Society, for this wonderful opportunity for us to share our views with our friends all over the United States and other parts of the world. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I believe it is on the screen, correct? People are seeing my PowerPoint presentation? No? Okay, then I will go ahead and let me see. Okay, what's happening here? Okay, something happened. All right, let me make this large. Okay, share screen. Can you see now the PowerPoint? Preventing justice? Okay, that's very good. So my purpose in showing this PowerPoint presentation is to show that really this conflict did not start on October 7th. Because if you would have listened to the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations yesterday, speaking, to the international community and to all the leaders, he's acting like, as if everything started on October 7th. But we know from the truth, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, that things started much, much earlier. And this is what I'm planning to show, the history and the background for October 7, because if that history was not there, there would not have been October 7. So, okay, so what we have is different groups that started, like Christian Zionism, secular Jewish Zionism, religious Jewish Zionism. These groups were advocating the concept that Palestine is a land without a people, for the Jewish people, a people without a land. Of course, we Palestinians were in that country for many, many generations, but they did not account for us, or they did not maybe consider us people, but they totally denied our very existence. on our land. In 1895, Herzl, he is the founder of Zionism or secular Zionism, wrote in his diary, "We must expropriate gently the private property of the indigenous population assigned to us. We shall try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for it in the transit countries while denying it employment in our country." So you can see that the founders of Zionism, they had a plan as early as 1895, that's quite early, to try to move the Palestinian population out of Palestine into the neighboring countries. Then the British had also an impact on that. Balfour came with the Declaration 1917, and he said His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, totally ignoring the rights of the Palestinians for a homeland. So this is the map of Palestine during the British Mandate, say from 1918 to 1948. Everything in the red is what we call, or was called for many, many centuries as Palestine. In 1947, Palestinians owned approximately 87.5% of Palestine, while Jews owned 6.6% of the total land mass. The remaining 5.9% was state land as classified under the British Mandate. So you can see the map on the right, the areas in the dark orange, these are the Jewish settlements in Palestine before 1947. All the rest is either Palestinian land or public-owned land. So just by taking one look at the map, you can tell that Palestinians really owned Palestine. Then comes Jewish leaders like Ben-Gurion with his expansionist agenda. He said, after we become a strong force as the result of the creation of the state, we shall abolish partition and expand to the whole of Palestine. And David Ben-Gurion also said, we must use terror, assassination, land confiscation, and the cutting of all social services to rid the Galilee of its Arab population. When you look at Gaza today, think of that, cutting of all social services. So on the left, you see a map of the UN partition of Palestine in 1947. And on the right, you see after the war of 1948, this became the map on the right. And you can see the areas in the shaded red is what we call today the West Bank. In the dark red is areas that Israel took from Palestinians in 1948. And the yellow area is what's supposed to be proposed Jewish state. All of these dots are Palestinian villages and towns that were destroyed and depopulated or ethnically cleansed by the Israelis in 1948. So you can have Palestinian refugees. You can see on the left, these are pictures of Palestinian refugees in 1948, and on the right, the current Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip today. And the United Nations early on decided refugees, meaning Palestinian refugees, wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. And those wishing not to return should be compensated for their property. And we know that Palestinians have not been compensated, and they were not allowed to return. No thanks to United States and using resolution after resolution to block the return of Palestinian refugees from returning back to their homes. A little bit about my family. This is where we lived in 1948. And my father, who was a civilian, was killed by an Israeli sniper, leaving my mother with 7 children. And I am on the extreme left right here. And then we became also refugees forced out of our homes, and we lost everything in 1948. But you can see that both Christians and Muslims became refugees in 1948. So this became the map in 1948. Now Israel took everything in the light yellow. Jordan took the West Bank. Egypt took over the Gaza Strip. Nothing left for the Palestinians to create a state. This is the map after 1967. You can see that Israel also took the Golan Heights. Jordan lost the West Bank to Israel, and Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip to Israel. Well, during that time, the Israelis started grabbing Palestinian land to build Jewish settlements, and that caused the Palestinians to have uprisings, 2 main uprisings. One of the results of Palestinian uprising is the creation of the Oslo Peace Accords between Yasser Arafat and Rabin and Bill Clinton right here. I wish I had the time to share more, but because of the limited time, I have just to go through it very fast. And you can see here the decline of Palestinian territory as Israel continued to expand. Pretty soon, that little area called the Gaza Strip here may also turn white. And this is what Israelis are doing in the West Bank, just building settlements, bypass roads, and choking the Palestinian presence with walls. Into Gaza, I took this picture in 2008, and here are more pictures of Gaza. And this is in 2014, when Palestinians were unarmed and went to protest the occupation. This is the result. Many Gazans were killed and many were injured. One of the problems have to do with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, because many Israeli leaders, even Netanyahu, have said construction of the third temple will not be an obstacle to peace with Palestinians. But you see, Palestinians responded with that on October 7. This is the Gaza Strip. For the last 16 years, it's been besieged, and other speakers will talk more about this. Finally, I just want to say, on many occasions, Hamas leaders extended an olive branch to Israel in the form of a 10-year truce, Hudna. Israel rejected such offers. Sorry, I had to go through this history that took about 75 years to 100 years in 7 minutes. Sorry for that, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Reverend Alex, for providing such an understanding of the history of the conflict in such a concise way. And we definitely wish we had more time to hear more. And thank you also for sharing how it impacted your own family. As we continue, Jonathan, since October 7th, it's estimated that over 18,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, of which about 70% are women and children under the age of 18 in Gaza. Food and water and electricity, we know, have been cut off by Israel to the Gaza Strip. We also know that violence is not just in Gaza, but there is also settler violence against Palestinian civilians in the West Bank. Can you speak on the current humanitarian crisis and the international human rights violations in both Gaza and the West Bank?
Yes, thank you. The state of Israel was really shocked on October 7 because Palestinians who they thought they had controlled very effectively, that they had choked up, that they were under siege for 16 years in Gaza. And Hamas was actually doing the job of Israelis to keep them under control. Every once in a while, they would, as they said, mow the lawn, go in and bomb a few places, and force people to be quiet. What happened in October 7 really shocked the Israelis, because these Palestinians living in the world's largest open-air prison broke out of their prison and attacked Israeli soldiers and civilians. And I want to be clear that whatever happened on October 7, any targeting of civilians on either side is wrong, is a war crime, cannot and should not be condoned. But Israel said, now that you have done this, we now have a free green light from the United States and the rest of the world to do whatever we want to do. Now, even if Israel was justified in reacting to Hamas, it was not allowed to do what it has been doing, which is carry out really actions that fit the definition of a genocide. And I don't use the word lightly. I use the word with its legal meaning, to do enough killing and to make life unlivable for a group of people based on their ethnicity or identity. So Israel, within the Zionist paradigm of a struggle over the land of Palestine, which Alex started talking about, Gaza was one of the worst examples of the failure of Zionism, because it had a lot of people, refugees, 2/3 of the population, but very little land. So Israel doesn't really want Gaza. They just want to get rid of the people. And when the people in Gaza refuse to disappear, Israel has been acting against them with clear genocidal intent. And I use the word, as I said, carefully. Israelis said this shows that the people of Gaza are subhuman, they are human animals, and they need to be eliminated and eradicated. And to make clear that they didn't mean just Hamas, that they meant everybody in Gaza, the president of Israel said there are no innocent people in Gaza. Everybody is a target. We're not even trying to be accurate. We just want to go for destruction. And destruction they have done. About 1.9 million out of the 2.3 million people in Gaza have been uprooted from their homes with nowhere to go. They have cut off the water and the food to the entire population, as well as fuel and communications. They made sure not to allow any foreign journalists to come into Gaza, and they started killing deliberately the journalists who are there. Already the number is over 80 journalists who have died since this particular action started on October 7. And they ordered the people to move south. And the biggest fear that Palestinians have is that this would create another Nakba, that they will be forced out of Palestine entirely, sent to Sinai, to the desert, to make the life so unlivable that just for survival, to have water, to have food, to have medical care, you need to leave Palestine, go to Sinai, and then you're somebody else's problem. You're the problem of Egypt, you're the problem of the international community, you're no longer our problem, because your land now becomes part of Israel. This has always been the Zionist goal, and not only for Gaza, it's also been the Zionist goal for the West Bank. Again, under the rubric of the fighting, when everybody is looking at what's happening in Gaza, the settlers have been going crazy in the West Bank, killing, shooting, frightening, and pushing people off of their land. About 12 villages have been depopulated. And for the rest of them, there are daily raids where the settlers with army support come in, shoot, scare, frighten people, and tell them openly, leave, because if you don't leave, we will kill you. Fortunately, Jordan and Egypt do not want to participate in this second Nakba and have made it clear they are not going to take in more refugees. How long this will remain the case, we don't know. But the actions of Israel clearly violate international law, clearly violate the conventions for the prevention and punishment of genocide, clearly violate the requirements against collective punishment, clearly violate the basic humanity and integrity of the Palestinian people. Whatever the reason for it, whatever the justification that Israel might want to give itself for attacking the Palestinians, the conduct of the war has been horrendous. The amount of bombs that have been dropped are amazing, amazing. Even the carpet bombing of Dresden during World War II, the number of children killed has been more than the children killed in all wars for the last 2 years throughout the world. And this is just the past 2 months. And it is continuing. And the amazing thing is that the United States has been fully complicit in this, not just in the sense of providing more and more weapons, heavy weapons, 2,000-pound bombs called bunker busters, which the Israelis are openly using here, there, and everywhere to totally and utterly destroy the Palestinian, not just their buildings, their libraries, the universities, churches, mosques, municipalities, courts, and hospitals. There's only less than half of the hospitals in Gaza are currently working, and they're all only partially working. They're not allowing fuel in, electricity, medical supplies, most importantly, water and food. They are literally starving the population in an attempt to push them out of the land. So the point that I wanted to make here, I guess, 2 points before my 7 minutes are up. The first is international law is being violated left, right, and center. Regardless of what the excuses Israel has to start the war, even if it was totally and completely justified, does not allow them to violate international law. Second, the United States government is directly complicit in what's happening, not only in providing assistance, military assistance, and financial assistance, but most importantly, in providing a diplomatic cover that gives legitimacy and that gives impunity to these violations of international law. That makes the United States actually implicitly complicit as a partner in the genocide that is taking place. I think that covers my 7 minutes.
Thank you so much for sharing with us what is happening both in the West Bank, which is something that I don't think a lot of the media picks up on and speaks of, and also just the way that you have mentioned the clear violations that are being committed. You also mentioned the complicity of the United States. And Kyle, it kind of goes into the question that we have for you. A week after October 7th, the Senate passed a bipartisan resolution supporting Israel and its right to self-defense and condemning Hamas's attacks on civilians. Congress and the Biden administration support for Israel remains entrenched. Most recently, the U.S. opposed the UN resolution for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. What role does the United States play in this continuing crisis?
Thank you, Aimee. And again, glad to be with you all today. It is fitting that I'm following Jonathan's remarks because I think he summarized well the realities of the complicity of our government in the ongoing military assault against the people of Gaza. Unfortunately, our role over the past now 2+ months has been to provide diplomatic and legislative cover to the violence that we're seeing every day in Gaza, and, as was rightly pointed out, the increase of attacks we're seeing throughout the West Bank, especially by settlers who have been emboldened by this current government to know that they can act with impunity and are actually being encouraged in many instances to take quote unquote justice into their own hands. So we've seen some small shifts from the administration in terms of the U.S. role, but there are some reports that maybe privately U.S. government officials are pressing a bit more directly with their Israeli counterparts. However, what we've seen is a consistent U.S. efforts to stop any forward movement for a comprehensive and sustained bilateral ceasefire. So again, we have been complicit in this ongoing violence. In the interest of time, I can't go over every legislative vehicle that has been introduced, but it's just been stunning to see, Congress moves very, very slowly on almost every issue. But since October 7th, there have just been so many resolutions and congressional bills that have been focused solely on supporting Israel's ongoing military campaign against the Palestinian people in Gaza, as well as bills that have been trying to stifle the rights of U.S. citizens to engage in protests. We've seen a lot of emphasis on trying to stop college students from organizing on their campuses. So a lot of efforts to stifle the free speech of American citizens to say that they are not supportive of this ongoing violence and military assault against the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So at a time when de-escalation and a ceasefire is desperately needed, the Biden administration and Congress have advanced policies that will only continue to increase the path of violence. So we have before Congress now the president's supplemental request for additional funding to Israel. It's part of a larger package. So there's some funding that's for other countries, but $14.3 billion would go to Israel. The House has already passed their version of that bill, and it's now currently before the Senate. It's in a bit of a stalemate over nothing related to Israel-Palestine, but related to issues between Democrats and Republicans on border security provisions. But the expectation is that it will eventually pass. And again, the funding to Israel is not part of any of the holdup here. This request from the president includes a portion of it is for $3.5 billion in future arms sales that actually undoes congressional waivers. So it's actually saying that Congress will not have oversight into how some of these arms sales will proceed, because it's giving latitude to the Secretary of State to waive congressional notification if he deems it in the U.S. national security interest. Over the weekend, we heard that the Biden administration is proceeding with an emergency sale of nearly 14,000 rounds of tank ammunition valued at more than $106 million. So this is separate from the $14.3 billion. It's a separate sale. And it's they completely bypassed the standard congressional review process. Normally, Congress is able to weigh in on this type of sale. However, they used something that is within their purview, but very rarely used to advance it in an emergency way without any congressional review process. So unfortunately, we are seeing time and time again, even as we see more and more deaths of civilians in Gaza and increasing of attacks in the West Bank, that Congress and the administration is just giving cover to this ongoing military assault. It is important to note, maybe ending on a little bit of a good note, quote unquote, that there is a growing number of congressional offices that are taking a principled stance in support of a ceasefire. We have around 61 members currently that have come out in support of a ceasefire. Several of them are on a resolution that was introduced by Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and Cori Bush. On the House side, there are about 4 senators as well who are supporting a ceasefire. Going back to that supplemental bill that I mentioned earlier, the $14.3 billion additional emergency funding to Israel, Senator Van Hollen from Maryland, along with 12 of his Senate colleagues, are trying to get an amendment to that provision that would ensure any aid given to any of the countries as part of the bill will be used in adherence to U.S. and international humanitarian law. So that really is like the bare minimum, but it at least is showing that there are some members of Congress who are getting to the point where they're pushing for stronger U.S. leadership at the moment.
Thanks, Kyle, for giving us further details on how the U.S. is being complicit in the continuation of the violence. David, as we speak on the continuation of this violence that is happening, and Jonathan mentioned this earlier as well, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territory stated that there is a serious risk of genocide in Gaza. And a month ago, on November 13th, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin for failing to prevent the continuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Can you speak more about this lawsuit and the discussion about whether the crisis in Gaza can be characterized as genocide, headed toward genocide, or is more characterized as a form of ethnic cleansing? And why is it so critical for the international community to engage in this discussion? And what is at stake in these kinds of terminations?
Great. Thanks, Aimee. And it's great to be on the panel here today with Alex and Jonathan and Kyle, and with everybody that's joining. You know, I hope we can get to all the different questions. So let me just say, I want to give an image, the biblical image, to shape the work of our advocacy work here and kind of answer those questions about genocide and the crimes that are taking place right now. And that's the story in Luke 18 of the widow and the unjust judge. That in many ways, the work of the Center for Constitutional Rights, the work of advocacy, the work of Churches for Middle East Peace, of Board of Church and Society and Global Ministries, is like the widow of demanding justice. And for a lot of times, those demands go unheard or unheeded by the powerful. And so there's been growing momentum of about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of calls and emails to Congress. And yet Congress has not yet changed, and the White House has not yet change their practices. But that widow, like today, there are too many widows in her day in first century Palestine, and there's way too many widows today in Gaza and across the West Bank. But they're not alone. So we don't hear in the biblical story of who was there with the widow that she could keep going to the unjust judge. And I want to suggest that international law and how Jonathan especially raised up international humanitarian law and war crimes, crimes against humanity sounds very legalese, but it's really like the growing pressure of the people around the widow demanding that governments and the powerful respond to the dignity and the well-being of all people. And that's what's at stake today. So the Center for Constitutional Rights, as lawyers, said, what's the role that we can do right now? And they looked at some of these reports, and early on, within 1 week, or 10 days in October, they sent a legal brief to all members of Congress, alerting them to the risk of unfolding genocide. And there's a couple things about genocide. Jonathan already laid some of that out, but I want to share this week marks the 75th anniversary of the UN adopting the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And that's really important. So much of human rights law and international law is seen in after crimes have happened. It's like after the building's been burned down, you kind of sort out, was it an arson? And then who should be punished, if anybody. But in fact, there's a duty to prevent And the convention early on, 75 years ago, laid out, we have a duty to stop genocide before it starts or as it started. And then the next day, that was December 9th, 1948. December 10th, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted as a preventive measure to say these are the rights that should be lifted up for everyone. Now, we were a long way from that in 1948, and sadly, we're a long way from that right now. And then the next day, on December 11th, Resolution 194 that Alex cited on the right of Palestinian refugees to return. Already at that point, there'd been tens of thousands of Palestinians, about 75% of Palestinians displaced from their homes, from their villages. And the UN acknowledged they should have that right to return. And I think it's important for us to hold together those three as we look at what's happening today. So the Center for Constitutional Rights filed a lawsuit against President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and Secretary Lloyd Austin on 2 counts. The first was failure in their duty to prevent, that the U.S. as a signatory of the Convention on Preventing Genocide had failed to prevent Israel from engaging in a number of crimes, the destruction of property and lives and infrastructure to such an extent that it made impossible for people in whole or in part to continue living. And so it's not just mass killing, it's making it impossible. And certainly today in Gaza, Israeli bombing and Israeli invasion has made it impossible for the people of Gaza, for Palestinians to live. And most of them were refugees from 1948. The second crime that they are charging them with is aiding and abetting genocide. So that by sending weapons, like what Kyle mentioned of the $100 million arms sale and the proposal of the supplemental, and all members of Congress have been warned by the Center for Constitutional Rights, if you vote for more military aid to Israel, you will be liable for criminal prosecution of the crime of genocide, of aiding and abetting genocide. And so part of what the UN can do is they don't have an army to arrest people, they don't have a police force, but they have the moral force to put people on notice. And then it's up to civil society, up to churches, trade unions, human rights organizations to enforce these laws when they're being violated so systematically. So how do we do that? It's shameful that the US had vetoed ceasefires and said there's not been enough killing. I mean, President Biden, and the decisions of a veto by the U.S. is the decision of the president. It's being implemented by people here in New York, across the street from me, but it's the president's decision. And so the president's decision was not enough killing had happened. There needs to be more fighting, and it was more important to blow up Gaza to try and get some of the Hamas fighters than to concern about humanitarian ceasefire, concern about access, concern about hospitals, journalists, and what Jonathan has already, so tragically described. I will say that, one of the other pieces around genocide is intent, and this sometimes can get people confused. So does it mean that all Israel has to say is, well, we don't mean to harm civilians? When 99.5% of all children killed in the last 2 months have been Palestinian. 95% and growing of all casualties from October 7th till today have been Palestinian. Is it enough to say we don't intend to harm civilians when in fact, and I don't have time now to do this, but Prime Minister Netanyahu, members of his cabinet, Israeli social media, Israeli public media have repeatedly described the intent to exterminate, massively destroy, level Gaza, described Palestinians as animals. I mean, it's really offensive and horrendous, the description. There's certainly plenty of documented intent, and the Center for Constitutional Rights 89-page brief plus the expert briefs are all available online at their website. So we'll make sure you get that link and you can look at some of the quotes that are out there. clearly there's intent, and we have a responsibility to stop it. So what can we do? I think we need to join the growing call around the world for an arms embargo on Israel, to say no one should ship arms, transport arms. So sometimes, a ship that's coming from the U.S. with these weapons, if it stops in Ireland, the Irish dock workers should not unload and allow that in. And in fact, there's been examples of dock workers being some of the leaders in these things of refusing ships to enter their port because they're bound for Israel with weapons or other places in terms of crime. So this is a tactic that's nonviolent to try and stop arms shipments. There's also, sadly, too many countries in the global south that are purchasing surveillance equipment and arms equipment from the Israeli military. They make a lot of weapons themselves. And so that also needs to be stopped. And we're pushing for that at the UN. So a complete arms embargo. A second thing is diplomatic sanctions. A growing number of states have recalled their ambassadors, but this is something the UN and the international community could call for, to say, we want to put the political leaders of Israel on notice that if you travel to other countries, you may be arrested under universal jurisdiction for crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And no amount of diplomatic immunity for being in a government position will absolve you of those crimes. So we can do more about that. The U.S. has, thankfully, acknowledged that extremist settlers are a problem and extremist settler violence. Well, several members of the Israeli cabinet are extremist settlers that have advocated violence. So shouldn't they be restricted to say, if they travel to another country, the U.S. would want to ban them? Should we freeze assets of dual citizens? There are many dual citizens of U.S. and Israel, France and Israel, Britain and Israel. How about freezing the assets of these settlers that are engaged just by where they live in international crimes against humanity in terms of the settlements being on Palestinian land? I say all these things, but like the widow, that won't happen just because it's the right thing to do. It needs massive support. And that's so I think we're so excited that people are joining the call here and joining with the church, many churches in ecumenical efforts, joining it not just in statements, but in calling for these actions by our members of Congress, by the White House and administration, by other member states at the UN as well. And it's been very exciting to work with international human rights organizations from Palestine, from Israel itself, like B'Tselem and Gisha and Yashdin, and Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, all pressing. Now, I saw one question in the chat that I want to briefly, and I'll end with that, and that was the question of apartheid. There's growing reports for years. Palestinian human rights organizations, like the one Jonathan founded, Al-Haq, have talked about apartheid since the 1990s. B'Tselem and Israeli human rights organizations have joined in that call. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, UN experts, UN committees. There's now a growing number of folks talking about and naming the Israeli apartheid as a serious crime against humanity that must be stopped. And I want to say right now, that becomes more clear than ever that when Hamas is referred to as a terrorist organization and Israel is talked about as a right to self-defense, you are setting two standards. That when war breaks out, invariably people move to an apartheid-like approach of one standard of laws for us, the good guys, and one standard of laws and practices for them, the bad guys, that us and them. And apartheid is that most systematic framework of that to persecute a particular group based on their identity. And so I think that as we look at this, without question, there's an apartheid dynamic going on in crimes of apartheid in terms of seizing the land, of set double standards of military courts for Palestinians, even the language we use, that you have Palestinian prisoners, but most of them are being held without charge. Why are they not hostages? Whereas Israeli military, who are engaged in an occupation of Palestinian land, are described as hostages in Gaza. So there's not time to unpack all that disparity, but I put that out there as a challenge for all of us to work on our language, to call for international human rights law, humanitarian law, as an answer that applies the same standards to condemn all targeting of civilians, to condemn all discrimination, wherever it might happen, and to lift up the well-being of people, and to say that those systems and those powers that try to maintain that injustice and that violence have to be stopped.
David, for just kind of giving us a lot of information, and also just kind of helping us to think about ways in which, and you mentioned it, of how organizations like the church can get involved, and which kind of leads us to the question that I have for Colleen. Many of those that are participating in this webinar today are United Methodists. The United Methodist Church has a long history of being a voice for peace in the region. Can you share with us resources and ways that people can be engaged now?
Yes, thank you so much, Aimee, for this important question. And thanks to all my fellow panelists. It's great to be among such amazing advocates and experts. And I know we only have a few minutes left in the webinar, so I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So talking a little bit about the history of the United Methodist Church, we have a long history of advocating for peace in the region and beyond. Regarding Israel and Palestine, since 1968, the church has condemned territorial expansion and aggression, supported justice for refugees, and advocated for ceasing arms sales to the Middle East. For decades, the church has been a witness for peace in Israel and Palestine, encouraging all United Methodists to come together in dialogue and support the creation of conditions in the Middle East where all peoples can live together in peace and enjoy equal rights. And throughout this history, despite the ever-changing dynamics on the ground, the church has remained firm in its belief that there are no military solutions to this conflict, and that the continued arms race will not bring security for the people of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And this has included condemning the continued occupation and suffering of the Palestinian people and the system of discrimination in Israel. And there is still a resolution on the books from the 2016 Book of Resolutions, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. It's Resolution 6111, opposition to Israeli settlements in Palestinian land. And just reading the first part of it, we seek for all people in the Middle East an end to military occupation, freedom from violence, and full respect for the human rights of all under international law. And the church opposes continued military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, the confiscation of Palestinian land and water resources, destruction of Palestinian homes, continued building of illegal Jewish settlements, and any vision of a greater Israel that includes the occupied territories and the whole of Jerusalem and its surroundings. And also calls on the Palestinian Authority and Palestinian religious leaders to publicly condemn violence against Israeli civilians and to use nonviolent acts of disobedience to resist the occupation and settlements. And this witness for peace has extended all over the globe to our peace building and justice efforts. We do take seriously, as disciples of Christ, the call to love our enemies, seek justice, and serve as reconcilers of conflict, and believe that war is incompatible with the teachings and example of Christ. And that's really pointing to the social principles, paragraph 165C, and also talking about Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And the church has really worked for self-determination for all peoples and nonviolent solutions to conflict, and stood in opposition to apartheid and occupation around the world. Just using one example, after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the church spoke out against the invasion of Iraq and called upon the U.S. to fulfill its first moral duty of nations to work to resolve conflict by peaceful means, which is also in the social principles, paragraph 165C. Justice for attacks like September 11th, or pointing to the October 7th Hamas attacks. I think this is the biggest point to drill down, is it will not come through more violence. Pointing to some reports that emerged on October 7th that Hamas and other militants committed sexual violence against Israeli women and girls. I want to uplift a statement from Madre, who's an international women's rights organization that condemned the attacks and called for investigation. And they also rejected quote, any presumption that our support for Palestinian liberation leaves no room for condemnation of attacks against civilians, or that compassion for Israeli victims requires an endorsement of Israel's assault on Gaza. And I really particularly want to uplift a statement, a quote from their statement from Israeli peace activists: "One massacre does not justify another." The Israeli bombardment of Gaza is not justice and is doing nothing to keep the people of Israel safe. If anything, it puts Israeli civilians more in danger as violence begets more violence. And scripture is consistent in this call to forgive others their trespasses, Matthew chapter 6, verses 14 and 15, and to overcome evil with good, Romans chapter 12, verse 21. And furthermore, as other panelists have pointed out, it's a humanitarian catastrophe for the people of Gaza. The international organization Save the Children recently reported that supplies and staff are no longer able to make it into Gaza. Infrastructure is destroyed. The UN aid coordinator for Palestinian territory said today that it's a textbook formula for epidemics and a public health crisis, with massive overcrowding in southern Gaza and a collapsed healthcare system that is unable to cope with dire conditions created by 2 months of intense bombing, which is why there's been a lot of international NGOs like Save the Children and Mercy Corps, Oxfam. They've been calling for an immediate ceasefire, and they penned that in an op-ed in the New York Times yesterday. So as other panelists have been talking about resources and what we can do right now to be engaged is call for a bilateral ceasefire. GBCS has a action alert, which I hope a lot of you have seen, where you can email your member of Congress and call on them to take action to de-escalate the conflict, uphold international law, and support unrestricted humanitarian aid. And we can put that in the chat as well. We saw that this pressure worked to secure a temporary ceasefire a few weeks ago, but unfortunately it's not enough. We need a permanent ceasefire as a first step to pave the road toward establishing long-term solutions. And above all, we pray for the innocent civilians, many of them children who have been caught in the crossfire or in harm's way in Gaza. We've participated in prayer vigils over the last 2 months held by Churches for Middle East Peace, other faith-based coalitions, grieving in community the loss of life and praying for a peaceful resolution. And as we pray, we also must remain steadfast in our witness for peace and call for an immediate ceasefire. And I'll end with uplifting one key quote from our partner, United Methodist Kairos Response, who is a co-sponsor of today's webinar as well. And they issued a statement back in October, and we can also share some resources from the group in the chat. The quote reads, "God's people dare not stand by and watch. We dare not be silent or carry on with life as usual while the United States provides support and encouragement for Israel to continue and expand this genocidal horror. Throughout the Hebrew and Christian testaments, we are told that God stands with the oppressed, and God's people are called to defend those who are oppressed by the powerful, whoever they may be." So I'll paraphrase some of that statement and say that from my own words, this means using our voice to stop the Israeli bombardment and call for a bilateral ceasefire from all parties. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. I'm realizing the time, and so if it's okay with all of our panelists, if 5 minutes is okay. I actually had 2 more questions, but I'm going to kind of like squish it into one. And this is a question for everyone that's on the panel. And if you can kind of provide like a 30-second response, that would be greatly appreciated. So the violence that we see in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank is also where Jews and Christians and Muslims all identify as the place of their religious stories and traditions. How, as people of faith, as Christians, are you theologically and spiritually reconciling the violence and the longing for peace, especially during this week of peace and Advent? And the follow-up question, as we are in this week of peace, especially when peace feels so absent, where or what do you see as a pathway to peace? And I'll just open it up to everyone.
Yeah, I think we are caught between the immediate task of stopping the genocide, creating a ceasefire, having access to just water, food, humanitarian assistance unimpeded, and between the long-term issue of justice in Palestine, Israel. Reconciliation, a resolution that allows people to live together. And I think in a way the two are related, strangely. Those who reject the call for a ceasefire are openly saying violence is the only way out. You need to destroy your enemy. You need to eradicate and eliminate your enemy. No policy, no international law, no negotiations, just destruction. That is the only path that is open. And those who call for a ceasefire are saying, wait a minute, just stop the ongoing destruction for both sides. Let's look for other methods of resolving this other than resort to violence. The second issue, of course, is justice. Because once you agree that violence is not the answer, once you agree that you cannot create either liberation or security through violence, then you have to start talking about justice. You have to start talking about the rights of the other side. You have to start talking about negotiation. You have to seek that which is for peace. And right now, the people who are in charge are saying violence is the only answer. We need to send 2 more warships. We need to send more weapons, bigger bombs, no restrictions, no restraints, no controls, no oversight. Just kill, 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 destroy, destroy, destroy until you achieve your objective. So in a way, it really is a spiritual fight that we have to fight. A spiritual fight, which is, after all, the whole message of Christ's coming at Christmas, declaring peace on earth, goodwill to men, asking us to be peacemakers. He is the Prince of Peace. So we should clearly be on the side of saying, stop this madness, create a ceasefire immediately, and start looking for a just peace. It is really, for me, amazing that the church has been so tepid, so reluctant, so controversial, so unwilling, so slow to speak forthrightly for an immediate cessation of hostilities, an immediate ceasefire, and working for justice.
Others.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would totally agree with you. You know, I go to a church here in Eugene, and all of this is happening. You know, all the massacres of Palestinians and Israelis were massacred too. And there's not a word, not even a prayer in the church that addresses the situation. That is so unlike Christ. You know, how can a church be so callous to the situation in the Holy Land that they don't even say, come on, congregation, let us have a prayer for the people in Israel and Palestine? I agree with you, Jonathan, that the church is way behind and they are out of step with the teachings and the example that Jesus set for us in the Gospels.
I know that we're over time probably at this point, so I'll echo what both Jonathan and Alex have said. I just think, especially for those of us Christians here in the U.S., we know that we have great privilege and great power, and we're called as followers of Christ to work toward a future in which all of God's creation can flourish, right? And we know that our world does not yet reflect that, but we are called to actively participate in that transformative work of justice. And so, at times when it seems that it is beyond our grasp, that is the exact moment when we need to redouble our efforts to commit ourselves to that hard work of discipleship and peace that we're called to. And so, it's easy for those of us who, feel that this is far away from us, or maybe doesn't directly impact us like the way that it does impact Jonathan and Alex. But those are the moments where we're called really, again, to be willing to do what is necessary to work for justice and peace, even when the situation seems beyond repair.
Thanks. So I'll offer 7 quick points. I think there's 7. Maybe. The first is that, in war and fighting and violence, we have to remember there are 2 wars going on at the same time, at least. One is the war on the ground that we've talked about that's so devastating. But the other one that we've touched on a bit, but could talk about more, is the war of propaganda. The war that's raised in the media, they are evil, the us and them. And that's a theological battle, I think, or theological struggle, because we're trying to demilitarize and our language. So that's the first, is remember there's 2 wars going on, and we need to be conversant and peacemakers in both of them. The second thing is the Bible talks about, a connection to the land. There are 3 faiths that have deep, deep connections of spirituality to the land, but connection to the land is not the same as claiming a monopoly on state power and the use of violence. And so we need to understand that all faiths can have this relationship, should have this relationship, and should be celebrated for that, but not to the exclusion of others. Mm-hmm. The third point is I work across the street from the United Nations, and right down the street is the Isaiah wall that says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. That's also in Micah, in the 4th chapter of Micah. And Micah goes on to add something that I think is really critical right here for the wonderful Holy Land of Palestine, Israel, is everyone shall live under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. So if we enable folks to live, for farmers in Gaza to live and harvest their land in the West Bank, to not be afraid, then God will be blessing us with the work of, the fruits of peace. So the next point after that, I forget what number I'm on, is don't violate the 10th commandment. Like, do not covet. There's a whole lot of coveting going on. Like the Zionist project, as Alex so eloquently described, was we want the land of somebody else. And David Ben-Gurion, I'll give one quote. Sorry, I know we're late, but somebody asked him as a, why do you think that you have a right to all the land here? Palestinians are living here. And he says, well, the God I don't believe in gave it to us. And it's like, it sounds flip, but it was like that's the propaganda war, using theology to justify. And the Kairos Palestine document is powerful. Please, folks, go and read that. And it says that part of being nonviolent is not allowing your opponent, your enemy, the one you would disagree with, to keep doing harm. But you have to stop that harm through the logic of love. So if it's not an act of love, to engage with those you disagree with. And so I'd invite us all to think about folks in your community, your congregation that have different views. Engage them in a loving way, but not in a silent or passive way. And finally, let's join the widow. That story in Luke 18 is like how to pray always. And Jesus' example is it's a woman, someone who suffered loss and harm, and it's a ministry of erosion with our feet. And so I think as we join her, we'll be following the angels of when they say to the shepherds, do not be afraid.
Amen.
Thank you, Colleen.
Oh, no, I don't want to take up too much time because I know we're already very over. I know just one thing I want to add is I'm trying to really take leadership from the Palestinian Christians that had a delegation to Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. And as it has been discussed, they're suspending Christmas celebrations, but they're continuing to connect with the spiritual meaning of Christmas and mourning with Gaza and focusing on advocacy and prayer. And I'll just end with, we can't look away from what's happening. I think this week of Advent must call us to action and to call for public witness and share our call for justice in the public square, to build collective awareness, to invite others to join this call and to hold decision makers accountable. And we have to continue to share this call throughout the Advent season and really talk with our loved ones about why this is important, and be in community to grieve, pray, and take action.
Thank you all. And as you know, unfortunately, because of time, we're not able to have the Q&A portion, but we will hold the questions that you have all submitted, and I'll be sharing it with our panelists. As we come to a close for this webinar, especially on the second week of Advent, our yearning for peace cannot just be a yearning, but we must seek it and act. And many of our panelists have mentioned how we can take action and that we must take action. As mentioned earlier, an email will be sent later today with resources. I know a lot of things have been dropped, like documents here and links here. We will collect all of those and we will send it to you. And we hope that it will be helpful. Thank you to Reverend Alex, Jonathan, Kyle, David, and Colleen for being with us today to help us better understand and for equipping us to be advocates for peace. Our prayer is that this webinar is an act of prayer as we seek a ceasefire and as we work for peace. And so, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for being with us today.
Sure.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.